Hello everyone, I'd like to warmly welcome you to the event Beethoven and Mann, Political Artists in Revolutionary Times. My name is Nicola Blaumer and I'm the Program Director of the Thomas Mann House in Los Angeles. For the recording of this event, we invited two wonderful guests. Bill Kinderman is a musician, a pianist, a musical scholar at the University of California in Los Angeles, and Mark Swed is a music critic for the Los Angeles Times. Facing the rampant pandemic and its dangers, they found refuge on the lawn of the Thomas Mann House last week. They enjoyed the Californian sun, and you can have today a view of our house and the surrounding areas. December 17th is the 250th anniversary of Ludwig van Beethoven, one of the most political composers. No other similarly important musician is as closely associated and positively associated with freedom. This has to do with the dramatic period in which he lived, a period in which musicians not only reflected those in power, but in which they also critically dealt with and questioned political and social structures. The opera Fidelio, Beethoven's signal against tyranny, is a famous example. And of course, also the Ninth Symphony, which is both claimed by democratic protest movements as well as totalitarian regimes. Thomas Mann shouted in September 1945 from this place here in California towards Germany, what stupidity it took to hear Fidelio in hymnless Germany without covering the face with his hands and falling out of the concert hall. I'm very glad that Bill Kinderman and Mark Swed will help us to understand the contradictory political legacy of Beethoven as well as his relationship to Thomas Mann. Special thanks go today to Benno Herz, Boris Scharschmidt and Michaela Ullmann for their support. And I'd also like to thank the loyal supporters of the Thomas Mann House, above all the German Foreign Office, as well as the Goethe Institute. Dear listeners, dear viewers, please enjoy the program Beethoven and Mann, Political Artists in Revolutionary Times.
Bill, anyone who knows anything about Beethoven knows he was a revolutionary composer, one of the great revolutionaries in music. Maybe Schoenberg and John Cage would be the only other two even comparable in terms of changing the way we think about music as much. But you've shown that Beethoven was a revolutionary, plain and simple. I mean, politically, you've shown his life through an arc of being a revolutionary. The French Revolution was a constant for him. And very much the way you show his life and his work is the attempt to maintain the ideals of a revolutionary in all of the changes that go on. He seemed almost as obsessed with Napoleon as the world is today with Donald Trump. And it affected the way he wrote he changed music in part because he was a revolutionary politically, wouldn't you say? And let me just begin by saying you begin your book very early on by saying the political relevance of Beethoven's music remains tangible.
I think that's true. When we realize that Beethoven grew up in a politically progressive region of the Rhineland, not far from France, and he came of age at precisely the time that the French Revolution broke out in July 1789. Furthermore, that one key figure in his life, when he inscribed at the newly founded University of Bonn, Eulogius Schneider, was something of a revolutionary firebrand, a very important figure for Beethoven who made possible the young composer's most important work from the Bonn period, the Joseph Cantata, and who then was forced out of his professorship at Bonn because of his intransient radical views, went to revolutionary France, to Strasbourg, was the first to translate the Marseillaise, which had been written in the succeeding years as a French revolutionary battle song in that city. The first to translate that into German for the predominantly German-speaking population there, and that during the Robespierre tumult, Schneider was himself guillotined. And just as one example, Beethoven never forgot his teacher and model. Schneider, there's a reference as late as 1819 about this. In short, when Beethoven left the Rhineland in 1792 to go to Vienna, he left a very progressive political environment for one that had turned strongly reactionary. And the best way to understand that is that the Kaiser, the emperor at Vienna, Emperor Franz, was none other than the nephew of Marie Antoinette, the Austrian Archduchess, who had become the Queen of France, but who was then imprisoned and guillotined in 1793.
And throughout this, I mean, Beethoven had the huge disappointments as a revolutionary of what had happened to the French Revolution, the way Napoleon, whom he had seen as someone with great promise, had succumbed to all of the evils of power. And what I think is extremely interesting is that, and maybe you can talk about this in individual pieces, is that as we follow the arc of Beethoven and we see how he tries to deal with the various issues, we get the situation of it's really not, it becomes more not what Beethoven means to us so much as how do we live up to Beethoven? He's showing a model of everything you do is in some ways coping with your idealism. What do you think?
Yeah, I think.
And how do, and then there's the huge relevance of that to almost everything that's going on in our lives. As you point out, I mean, there's just one kind of revelatory surprise after another of climate change, of kitsch. So maybe you could talk about how some of these works, how Beethoven really is dealing with the specific issues of idealism and how he transforms things through that.
There's some fascinating parallels between the period that Beethoven lived through, starting in 1789, when he was 19 going on 20, and soon to transplant himself to Vienna, where he remained, and the period that we are going through now, when we reflect that in 1989 and thereafter, with the collapse of the Soviet empire, that there was a widespread and rather naive optimism that we were entering a new phase of democracy. And we know how misleading that turned out to be. In the same way, the revolutionary fever in the wake of the French Revolution in 1789 into the 90s was severely disappointed. And one strong influence on Beethoven's aesthetic viewpoints and his intellectual development was Friedrich Schiller, the poet and philosopher whose text Beethoven used in his famous Ninth Symphony. Now, Schiller himself became a refugee, settled in Jena as a history professor, then developed his long friendship and collaboration with Goethe. And it was Schiller who promoted the idea that if we're disappointed by political developments, as occurred fairly soon, and certainly by the time of the Reign of Terror in France in 1793 to 94, that the artist or the person devoted to culture could nevertheless be nourished by the idea of what he called an effigy of the ideal. The conviction that one sets forth nevertheless an envisioned goal with political and social relevance, despite political disappointment. And if we reflect then on Beethoven's path, I think we can see how deeply he imbibed some of Schiller's ideas. Here's an example. There was in Schiller's Don Carlos a play that Beethoven took to heart and which was something like required reading in Beethoven's circle of friends and colleagues in Bonn already. There's a figure named the Marquis de Posa. Well, the Marquis de Posa is looking at the historical period of the Inquisition in the Netherlands from the standpoint of a liberal from the 1780s. And one model for the Marquis de Posa was none other than the Marquis de Lafayette, the Frenchman who rode alongside George Washington and was a key figure in enabling the American revolutionaries. So when the Marquis de Lafayette went back to France in the course of the 1790s, he tried to mediate between the two sides, found there was too much political polarization for that to work, feared for his own neck around the period 1793, went over to the Allied side, was mistrusted, and then imprisoned, and after a botched escape attempt, was placed in solitary confinement in an Austrian prison in Olmütz, and even an attempt of George Washington to influence Emperor Franz failed. So who liberated the famous American revolutionary helper, the Marquis de Lafayette? It was none other than Napoleon in the period when he was first consul and enjoyed his victories in northern Italy, where he was hailed as a liberating figure. And this fits into the context of Beethoven's enthusiasm for Napoleon in the period up to around 1800 or just after 1800. And then what happens is that by stages, Beethoven, like many others, are disappointed as Napoleon consolidates his power, reaches an agreement with the Pope, and then finally crowns himself emperor in 1804. And by this point, Beethoven is thoroughly disgusted with Napoleon, cancels his plans to resettle in France, and nevertheless remains fascinated by Napoleon because his disappointment with the autocratic Austrian regime was so profound that one still hoped that maybe Napoleon would shake things up and bring some hope of positive change that was otherwise not to be expected at all. And another example later on is when Beethoven had the chance around 1810 to compose his music to Goethe's Egmont, a highly political work. And elements from the Egmont music find their way into the final version of his very political opera Fidelio in 1814. This is only possible because Napoleon, for the second time, occupies Austria and its capital Vienna in 1809, and that brings, paradoxically, some liberalization and a relaxation of censorship. And it's fascinating to observe then that even a figure like Schiller benefited from this, because most of Schiller's plays during that whole period were censored and not presented on the stage. Beethoven and his colleagues were inspired by Schiller, but this depended mostly upon reading the plays and discussing them and not seeing them on the stage.
Bill, this brings up the issue of heroism, which was central to Beethoven. It goes throughout his work. He was almost obsessed with this idea. We know, of course, that famously the Eroica was first to be dedicated to Napoleon, and then he withdrew that dedication once he became, disillusioned by Napoleon. But heroism continues through his work. Fidelio is all about that, although here it becomes the kind of feminine ideal that was so important in the French Revolution. The whole feeling of going from light to dark, from dark to light, from dark to light in Beethoven's music is what so many people respond to and come away from the Fifth Symphony, come away from so many pieces feeling so much stronger that you've gone through something, that there's been this heroic action. Can you speak about how that actually operates in Beethoven?
It's a great question. And a key work is Beethoven's first composition for the stage, but a work that most people don't know. The ballet music, The Creatures of Prometheus, which had more than 20 performances and is the direct predecessor of the Eroica Symphony. So that the contradance, a musical form itself, which stood for liberalization because it's a line dance involving an exchange of partners and reflected the erosion of class distinctions in the 1790s. This contradance is associated with the glorification of the Titan Prometheus, who steals the fire from the gods and then fashions or burns a heart in each of these clay figures who are the proto-humans, the original kind of man and woman, who receive an aesthetic education from Prometheus and very slowly and gradually display some awareness of the sacrifices of Prometheus on their behalf. Now, how does this relate to a work like the Eroica? It's quite concrete in the sense that the four movements of the Eroica have the character of first struggle, then death, then rebirth, and then apotheosis or glorification. And it's the last stage where the contradance from the Creatures of Prometheus is employed. Well, many years later, in the 1820s, when Napoleon died, Beethoven's response was dry. He said, "I've already written music for that catastrophe." And what I'm sure he meant was that the sense in which Napoleon conformed with the heroic framework was confined to the first two movements of the Eroica. The sense of struggle, which maybe corresponded to Napoleon's positive role in the later 1790s when he was first consul, and then death, because indeed Napoleon had disappointed the expectations of heroism. He was no longer a hero in Beethoven's view. And yet the mythic framework of Prometheus lends itself in a timeless way to all kind of times and places. And so the rebirth of that ideal with the three horns in the trio of the third movement of the Eroica, and then the remarkable idea of the Eroica finale stands for the heroic principle, but in a way that many of us today don't immediately recognize. It's an open concept which is a kind of celebration of artistic creativity.
And what about audiences in his day? What would they recognize? What would they hear in this? Would they get any sense? Was it a political statement to them?
Well, when we recreate the local audience in Vienna at the time, we realized that a core part of that audience had been two performances of the ballet. Mm-hmm. So they would at least, at some of them, have recognized the reuse of the contradance in the Eroica. And Beethoven then fashions motivically a network of musical relationships. So even the first movement is connected to the end. And so I think that's a clear enough connection. And if we move to some other works, you mentioned, I think, the Fifth Symphony in passing, that's an excellent example of the way in which Beethoven is absorbing some allusions to French revolutionary currents into his symphonic music. And so it's the passage from darkness to light is especially felt in the passage from the shadowy reprise of the scherzo movement, going almost to inaudibility, and then plunging into the final movement with its reinforcement with trombones, later with piccolo. And there are two sections in that movement where Beethoven introduces in forceful nature a theme that goes like dum bum 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 bum, which was at that time a well-known tag motivically. La liberté was the connection.
And do people hear that? Did they hear?
Yeah.
You think they would hear that?
I think at that time they heard it.
would.
And in fact, there's some allusions at the time. The Marseillaise, which is, of course, one of the most famous revolutionary songs ever penned, that Soima, the well-known commentator and traveler from the early 1800s, reported that once he disturbed the serenity of a Viennese coffee house by just whistling that famous tune, and created much consternation.
No, but you even show that the Marseillaise, Beethoven makes subtle allusions to that on the Pathétique Sonata, which I had never noticed before. But I mean, would anybody notice that? Are these private messages that Beethoven's sending out?
I think that we're dealing with the situation with Beethoven in the early 1800s, in which we should realize that because of the polarization of international politics and the expansion of revolutionary France, and the circumstance that Austria, together with Prussia and Russia, became opposing states to France, there was heavy censorship of words. However, other arts, to some extent the visual arts, and even more music, could avoid those controls. Franz Grillparzer, who knew Beethoven, once commented in one of Beethoven's notebooks with envy that the censors had no idea what what Beethoven was thinking in his music. And so it's a situation in which there could be a message conveyed. And one outstanding example of this that you alluded to already is the role of Leonora, the feminine heroine, in Beethoven's very political opera, Fidelio. He would have preferred to have called it Leonora. It exists in 3 versions from 1805, 1806, and 1814. But what that mirrors also is the fact that in the French Revolutionary period, when the statues of the king were knocked down, they were typically replaced by an idealized, classically robed figure that stood for liberté. And Leonora is so fashioned in the opera that she can come to stand for that figure. When the imprisoned freedom fighter Florestan is languishing close to death in the dungeon, in the 1814 version, he finally has this vision of Leonora as not only a distant beloved, but an angel of freedom. And that angel of freedom is none other than the emblematic, idealized figure that we know from the famous gift of the French to the Americans that stands in New York Harbor, the Statue of Liberty.
Emperor Franz, who didn't particularly cotton to Beethoven, thought he was, possibly a bit dangerous, a little subversive. Was Beethoven dangerous?
Well, there are various reports. Emperor Franz definitely harbored suspicions of Beethoven. The relationship between the two of them was very cool. Fortunately for Beethoven, he had in his student, the Archduke Rudolf, one reliable and important figure in the royal family who served as his patron. But Emperor Franz was suspicious. There was a secret service file on Beethoven in the period of the Congress of Vienna that was compiled between 1813 and the years thereafter. Another critic of Beethoven, the Abbé Gelinek, who was also a pianistic rival, in one of Beethoven's notebooks wrote down at one point, there's a notice that says Gelinek was in the Kamel. It's a restaurant that still exists in Vienna, zum Schwarzen Kamel in the first district. And Gelinek was complaining about Beethoven, griping about the emperor, about the archduke, and about the whole regime. And Gelinek predicted that Beethoven would end up on the gallows. So in a smaller circle, there was definitely a sense that Beethoven was a little bit less than, he was not entirely harmless, but on the other hand, he was regarded as enough of a recluse and an eccentric that he was never seriously bothered. And the only time he was arrested once as a kind of tramp had other causes.
Sort of reminds me of the relationship between Eisenhower and Leonard Bernstein, except that Bernstein wasn't a recluse.
However,
okay.
Just to add a little bit to that, Beethoven played it on the edge. And when we consider that he was willing in 1808 to receive an invitation from Napoleon's younger brother Jerome, who had been installed in Kassel as the King of Westphalia. And he would have become the Kapellmeister in Westphalia. He said that because of cabals and mistreatment in Vienna, he had to leave the last remaining German kind of political state in French-dominated Europe. And he threatened to go to work at the court of Austria's enemy. And his gambit worked out because 3 aristocrats, including the Archduke Rudolf, said, well, no, you better stay here. We'll pay you an annuity to remain in Austria, which was, of course, a positive thing in 1809, but the currency, due to the Napoleonic War conditions, devalued his annuity very quickly.
Now we have this, there's a popular impression of Beethoven as being this fairly grim character who was, so strongly idealistic, uncompromising. You do point out his human qualities, particularly he did succumb to write a few pieces of kitsch, and you have a discussion of kitsch in the book, which is very interesting and one that goes very much against the way people feel about kitsch today, which is kind of celebrated as almost a high art. And maybe do you want to talk about how Beethoven did give in to write a few politically servile pieces, you might say?
Indeed. The period in question is between 1813 and 1815. It's after Beethoven's immortal beloved crisis in 1812, a period when there's evidence that Beethoven himself was rather depressed. But he saw some opportunities and seized them. And the first of these was actually a work not for the Congress of Vienna, but a collaboration with Maelzel, an inventor and businessman, to seize upon the victory of Wellington over Napoleon's forces in Spain. And this resulted in Beethoven's Battle Symphony, Wellington's Victory, with 2 competing orchestras representing the French and British forces and 188 minutely notated cannon shots. This was an extravaganza by all measures, not the greatest of Beethoven's works. And when Beethoven later on read a negative critique of Wellington's victory by the well-known critic Gottfried Weber, he wrote down in his copy, he said, "Oh, you dreadful scoundrel, my shit is better than anything you've ever thought." But the comment typically cuts both ways, because he seems to be implying that although he didn't appreciate the critique, that it was not his best work. And he's also recorded as having said about that piece that the best thing about it was that he managed to thrash the Viennese. Another work, The Glorious Moment, is a ceremonial cantata, the one piece in which Beethoven nods to Kaiser Franz, the emperor, but the piece is really bombastic with a highly questionable text, rhyming, for example, Franz with Glanz, and it is a rather hollow splendor that is put forth here, and that's the reason that the piece is rarely done. But Beethoven was aiming here to tailor his work for popular success in the moment. He was not trying to produce something that would remain an enduring artwork for decades or centuries to come. And so I think we need to appreciate Beethoven here as a pioneer of kitsch, someone who understood that you could write differently in order to make a splash.
Mm-hmm. In 1815, there was the eruption of Tambora, and a huge climate change in the world was caused by that, and it created a somewhat fallow period for Beethoven. But all along, there is this whole environmental aspect of Beethoven's music that you write about, his sensibility to nature, obviously the Pastoral Symphony, Pastoral Sonata, but it seemed to be a much deeper thing than that too, this whole idea of art and climate. And at the time, Humboldt and some of the other great naturalists thinking the idea that mind and nature were interconnected. And how does Beethoven sort of fit in today with our own great concern about the environment?
One of the organized environmental movements promoting a response to climate change has adopted Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony as a significant work. And that is very much in tune with the composer's convictions. Beethoven rejected traditional Catholic kind of perspectives, feeling that an access to higher cosmic reality could be gained by the individual more directly and through nature, a la Schelling, a la Alexander von Humboldt. He was a great nature lover. And this is reflected in the connections between various works and some of his songs, including a remarkable song based on the quail by the poet Sauter. And when we look then further into his career toward 1816, we realize that there was already then a foreshadowing of the concerns about the global environment. And Beethoven and his contemporaries experienced this. What happened was that with the explosion of Tambora in Indonesia, at just the time when the Congress of Vienna ended in Austria, on the other side of the world, that supervolcano blew about 5,000 feet off the top of the mountain, and the climactic cooling lasted, most severe in the northern hemisphere, for 3 years. And so looking through the Beethoven letters and sources, I noticed from 1817 recurrent observations and complaints about the persistent, cool, rainy conditions that probably had a contributing factor too to Beethoven's somewhat despondent period at this time, maybe his lowered artistic productivity.
And in our own very nice environment right here at the Thomas Mann house, shortly after Thomas Mann moved in here in 1943, he began Doktor Faustus, his novel. And you refer to it in a couple of times, and once in connection with Beethoven's Last Piano Sonata, Opus 111, in which, in Doktor Faustus, there is reported a lecture on Opus 111 and some of the most sort of egregiously flowery terms you can think of, trying to understand where Beethoven was going with this sonata in its great transformation, as you explain it, from dystopia to something, beyond sublime, actually. And I think you kind of gently explain what really is going on with Beethoven at that point, and the whole concept of transformation, which is essential to what Beethoven was able to do. And maybe his greatest accomplishment was his ability, and particularly through variations, to create this kind of transformation that is more than just going from one place to another. I mean, you point out at the end of Opus 111, it's not that you've actually reached one place, but he's brought different things together into one that's comparable to the way we think about quantum mechanics right now. And you state at one point that with Opus 111, the problems facing humanity today could be found in the models of transformation of Beethoven. Do you want to explain how that really works?
Yeah, to return to Thomas Mann for a moment, this is a theme we could also pursue in connection with Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. But
that was going to be my next question.
Yeah, in the case of his final piano sonata, Opus 111, Thomas Mann absorbs this theme into his narrative in an earlier point of this great novel that he wrote here in Pacific Palisades. And he has Wendel Kretschmar, the teacher of Adrian Leverkuhn, the Faustian figure of the novel. Wendel Kretschmar delivers a lecture recital of Beethoven's last piece. And he talks about the end, the passage you were talking about, replete with trills and etherealized transcendental textures, ending in a kind of mysterious silence as the tones finally recede into the distance. This is a good example of a Schillerian effigy of the ideal. Because it's pitted against the first movement that is clearly highly tragic and broken. And the second movement, paradoxically, maintains a tangible connection to outward reality because it was influenced by another variation project, the Diabelli variations, based on 33 transformations of a commonplace waltz that Beethoven called a cobbler's patch. And he was asked to write just one variation on this publisher's theme, and instead produced his largest work for piano altogether, a kind of microcosm of his entire art. And naturally, this bears something in common with Thomas Mann. Beethoven, like Thomas Mann, had a profound sense of irony, that in relationship to what we are given and what we experience in the outward world, one can expand the response through very many levels of critique or transformative thinking. And so I think at the end of the Sonata Opus 111, with its extraordinary treatment of rhythm and register, its pulsations, the way in which the rhythmic levels are connected to one another, Beethoven succeeds in projecting a fascinating effigy of the ideal.
The other piece at the end of the discussion in your book and is about Beethoven's Ninth. And there is this, to me, very important issue of its reception. This is the work that is so well known as that great idealistic work, certainly of going from the dark to the light, the great ode to joy at the end, which you say, can have some dubious implications. And now we've heard this piece so often. It is played so much. It is so overplayed. It is the anthem of the European Union. It's in the air. Everybody does it. And what about this whole sense of overfamiliarity, of being blunt, the message being completely blunted because of that? Can Beethoven survive that?
I think so, and that it's helpful if we recall that Beethoven himself had some doubts about the choral finale. And according to one reliable witness, said that even after the first performance of the Ninth at Vienna in 1824, that he might change it. And sure enough, the sketchbooks show that Beethoven considered over and over the possibility of an instrumental finale. Now, we know what he made of that material because the main theme of that envisioned instrumental finale of the Ninth Symphony was used as the last movement of Beethoven's A minor string quartet, opus 132, one of his most despairing works, preceded by a piercing, despairing recitative in the first violin, and containing the celebrated movement, the sacred song of thanks from a convalescent to the Godhead in the Lydian mode, whose main chorale theme is like a slow motion, inverted version of the joy theme. So now the joy theme itself has a folk song-like character. It's shaped as a kind of circular tune. It's presented without a shred of accompaniment clothing when it first appears in the low strings. And this is so that there is an easy entry point into the work in connection with the idea in Schiller's text of the millions, the Millionen, all of the inhabitants of the globe who at the climax are staring up at the cosmos. Über Sternen muss wohnen, above the stars must he dwells, referring to the creative force behind the universe. Now the question that arises is, how can we defamiliarize ourselves to view this freshly in a way that makes it seem like it's quite remote from something stereotyped, over-predictable. And I think that that's quite possible when we realize that Beethoven at this point, late in his life, quite deliberately goes back to the early phase of his engagement with Schiller, takes hold of a poem that Schiller himself almost disowned in 1803, and then that the consequence of this has been so far-reaching that it has encircled the globe.
Mm-hmm. By defamiliarizing ourselves, we are also opening ourselves to multiple interpretations of something like this, and to maybe end where Nikolai began, with Thomas Mann railing from this house against the Nazi appropriation of Fidelio. That made me start thinking about a film that there is of Furtwängler conducting the Ninth Symphony. And it's an amazing performance, the Berlin Philharmonic. The last movement is just ecstatic. It's one of the great performances of the last movement. And you just see this orchestra and Furtwängler in this state. And then the camera pans. And first you see an audience of wounded Nazi soldiers. And you've realized the entire audience is pretty much Nazis. And then it goes up into the boxes, and there you see elite SS people. Who knows, maybe Himmler is there, maybe who knows who's there. But it's absolutely chilling the way this got appropriated. And then it makes me think here in this funny little area here in Pacific Palisades, right after the war, well, actually right before the war, and right before Mann moved in here, and right before he started writing Doktor Faustus, just down the hill, 2 miles from here in Santa Monica, lived the young John Cage, who had just finished studying with Schoenberg, who was absorbing all kinds of new ideas and ready to completely take Beethoven on, essentially. And the year after Doktor Faustus was published, Cage actually came back. He was then in New York. He came back to LA, gave a performance of his brand new sonatas and interludes at the Monday evening concerts, which is a place that I don't think Mann ever went to those, but Schoenberg went all the time. Klemperer went. Mann would have heard about it because it was all over the news. And Cage also that summer teaching at Black Mountain College, which was the other place other than Pacific Palisades and Brentwood, where all German immigrants were on the East Coast. Cage gave a lecture about how Satie was much preferable to Beethoven. And that Beethoven, the whole idea of heroism, the whole idea of going from one place to another of the progression had to be overthrown. And in part because of the way we had thought about Beethoven. And that actually started a food fight in the cafeteria in the Black Mountain College between a lot of the old German immigrants, painters and academics, and some of the young pro-Cage students. And it all there was a lot of fomenting coming from right here. And where does that leave us now? We're in a point now where still every composer, not every composer, a lot of composers have still rebelled against Beethoven in a big, big way, and that whole concept of heroism. But then again, you have David Lang having just rewritten Fidelio. You have the project of 250 piano pieces for Beethoven, of which you've contributed one to. I just heard yesterday a broadcast from Vienna of the premiere of a new piece by Sofia Gubaidulina, orchestral piece, for Beethoven's 250th anniversary on December 16th. And in an interview, she said she's in private dialogue with Beethoven every day. Where are we? Where are we today in terms of Beethoven, the music, the politics, society?
I'd suggest that we distance ourselves from the idea that Beethoven is an artist who stands for some kind of a fixed idea of a work, as a kind of fortress of notes that is received and that has to be treated with a certain faith, that the interpreter's responsibility is simply to follow the text. And what I feel I've learned from spending many years looking at the Beethoven manuscripts and sketchbooks is how Beethoven seems to have been continually aware of multiple possibilities, and that the completion of some of these great works must have seemed to him even somewhat arbitrary, because whenever he returned to a project, if it was not yet published, he saw ways to make it richer, to make it better. And I don't think he would have minded at all that, to allude back to Cage and to Schoenberg and to the environment here in the 1940s, that there have been some performances, say, of the Ninth Symphony in more recent times, in which a work like Schoenberg's Survivor from Warsaw has been inlaid, even placed between the third and fourth movements of Beethoven's Ninth, as a way of placing Beethoven's striving toward something utopian, toward which we may project goals, but to realize that this is set against something very dark and very difficult, because Beethoven's entire legacy seems to have been like that. Maybe this goes very deep in his biography as well. He was, after all, the son of an alcoholic who, as a teenager, needed to petition the authorities to have his father's salary paid to him. His whole path was one of overcompensation in the face of troubles. And in that sense, much that Beethoven created and strove to create seems to resonate with our own troubled times.
Some years ago in Vienna, I heard a performance by a Norwegian composer who took a recording of Beethoven's Ninth and slowed it down so that it lasted 24 hours. And you could barely make out what was going on. You couldn't really, but you sort of thought you could. I spent a lot of time listening. I wasn't there the full 24 hours, but I heard a lot of it. And it was as if it was just in the air all the time. That Beethoven was just sort of there as an atmosphere. And does it feel like that now?
You know, Mark, I think it does, especially now in the time of the pandemic and the political instability that's plaguing us, not only in the United States, but the instability in other parts of the world as well. And when one reflects on the reception history of a work like Beethoven's Ninth, I think on the whole, one's inclined to think that despite the fact that the work has been abused, and it was played for Hitler's birthday, as you noted, it was the anthem for the racist regime in Rhodesia, it remains striking that worldwide, in so many parts of the world, it's played again and again such a significant role. Now, as you mentioned as well, in some areas, ritual performances with 10,000 participants in Japan raised the issue of conformism. On the other hand, in the political environment of 1989, Tiananmen Square in Beijing, the student protesters, who had reached 1 million strong, they rigged up private car batteries in order to broadcast Beethoven's Ninth against the propaganda of the state. In Chile, among other countries, even as recently as last fall, Beethoven's Ninth was performed in the streets as part of the protests or the striving toward economic and social reforms. In parts of Africa, there are symphonies that have sprung up in which Beethoven's Ninth is quite so significant. In Europe, in 2019, when the Brexiteers turned their backs in Strasbourg against the European Union, it was against the music of Beethoven's Ninth, which was serving as the anthem of the European Union.
And Angela Merkel dragged Donald Trump to a performance of it.
Yeah, conducted by Kent Nagano.
Yes. Another local from this area.
And then when the pandemic in Italy forced people into isolation, there was a movement in which people went out into their balconies, and the favorite piece was Beethoven's Ninth, and they sang this, and that whole trend spread up to Germany. So that some of the things online now, like the broadcast through the Banco Sabadell, is a presentation online of Beethoven's Ninth, which was cleverly filmed and began with a dapper double bassist in the town square playing, and a little girl puts a coin in his hat. And he continues to play, and it turns into the recitative of Beethoven's Ninth, and then one by one more instrumentalists join, finally the singers, and that rendition now has been viewed by almost 100 million people, which is uncanny in the sense that Schiller's text already is referring to the millions. It depicts in its very last line this spectacle of all the inhabitants of the earth staring awestruck up at the cosmos. And this was performed rather roughly, surely, in 1824 for apparently some hundreds of participants. It took decades before it began to spread across European and some North American centers, notably New York. And now it's spread across the entire globe. And it seems as if it's by no means being revoked, as Adrian Leverkuhn would have it at the end of Thomas Mann's Doktor Faustus. Things have changed since 1947.
Mm-hmm. So instead of the millions looking up, the millions are looking at it now on their cell phones. But Beethoven got his millions.